The air in Alexandria was a complex perfume, a symphony of competing scents that told the story of the city itself. From the west came the sharp, clean tang of salt, carried on winds that had touched the limestone brilliance of the pharaoh's lighthouse, a beacon for a new age. From the east wafted the sweeter, dustier scents of the Nile Delta, damp earth, flowering lotus, and the faint, ever-present smell of decay that promised renewal. And from the heart of the city, from the ever-expanding halls of the Museo and the Great Library, came the dry, almost sacred scent of papyrus, thousands upon thousands of scrolls waiting to be written, read, and argued over. To the girl Arsinoe, born in 316 BCE, this was the very breath of her world. A world she was beginning to understand was a cage, no matter how gilded its bars. She was a creature of shimmering duality. In the sun-drenched courtyards, under the tutelage of stern-faced Greeks, she was a Macedonian princess. Her mind was sharpened on the whetstone of Hellenic logic. She debated Plato, recited Homer, and traced the lightning-fast conquests of Alexander the Great across maps drawn on vellum. Her father, Ptolemy I Soter, the general who had audaciously snatched Alexander's body and this jewel of a kingdom, saw her as his finest Hellenic creation. But he looked at her with the eyes of a master artisan appraising his work, not a father seeing his daughter. The natural order is the Greek order, her Athenian tutor, Menander, would declare, his voice crisp with certainty. He pointed a slender finger at a depiction of Zeus and his squabbling yet separate divine family. The gods themselves respect these boundaries. Marriage is for the forging of alliances between separate houses. For a brother to lie with a sister, that is the act of barbarians, of Persians and the strange ones who lurk in the deserts. It is chaos. But after Menander dismissed her, an Egyptian priestess named Isis would come to braid her dark hair. Isis's hands were ancient, her skin wrinkled like dried papyrus, but her touch was gentle. She spoke in the hushed, melodic tones of the Old Kingdom. "The Greek speaks of his gods," she would whisper, her voice like the rustling of reeds. "Our gods are older. They do not forge alliances. They are the alliance. They are the whole. When the great Osiris took his sister Isis as his wife, it was not chaos. It was the weaving of the cosmos into a single perfect tapestry. Their love blessed the land, made it fertile. Their blood was too sacred to be diluted by the dust of mortals." Arsinoe, a girl of 14, with the unnerving stillness of someone who has learned to watch everything, stored these lessons in separate chambers of her heart. She learned to be two people, the sharp, logical Greek princess and the silent, observant vessel of Egyptian mystery. She understood the terrifying truth. For Greeks, it was a sin. For Egyptians, it was sacred. For a king like her father, both sin and sanctity were merely tools, levers of power to be used as needed. This abstract understanding became a horrifying, concrete reality on a suffocatingly hot afternoon. The summons came without preamble. Her father wished to see her in his private study, a room she had only entered a handful of times. It was not a place of comfort. It was the strategic heart of the kingdom. Maps covered the walls, battle plans were weighted down with polished stones, and the air smelled of ink, leather, and the cold ambition of a man who had outlived a god. Ptolemy sat behind a massive desk of Lebanese cedar. He did not arise. He simply watched her approach, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, assessing her not as a child, but as a strategic asset. He noted her posture, her beauty, her unsettlingly intelligent gaze. "You are of an age now," he began, his voice the calm, emotionless tone of a general issuing an order. "An alliance is needed to secure our eastern flank from the ambitions of Seleucus. Lysimachus, king of Thrace, has made an offer." He paused, letting the weight of the name settle in the room. "He is a lion of a man, one of Alexander's own. His kingdom is a bulwark. He asks for your hand in marriage." Arsinoe's blood ran cold. Lysimachus, the lion. A grizzled veteran, a legend from her father's generation. He was 55 years old. She was 15 years old. The numbers screamed in the silence of the room. This was not a proposal, it was a sentence. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of protests and pleas, but she knew better than to voice them. She saw the finality in her father's eyes. He had already moved the piece on his great board. "You will be a queen," he continued, as if that title were compensation enough for a stolen childhood. "You will do your duty to the dynasty. You will secure our borders." Duty, dynasty, borders. Cold, hard words. There was no mention of happiness or choice or love. She was a treaty written in flesh and blood, a golden shackle to bind the Ptolemaic eagle to the Thracian lion. As she gave her silent, terrified assent and backed away from the suffocating presence of her father, the complex perfume of Alexandria seemed to fade. All she could smell was her own sacrifice, acrid and absolute. The gilded cage had just shrunk to the size of a tomb. The journey from Alexandria was a slow, painful amputation from everything she had ever known. The deep blue of the Egyptian sea gave way to the choppy, unpredictable gray of the Aegean. The familiar warmth on her skin was replaced by a persistent, damp chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Thrace was not a land of sun-drenched stone and vibrant markets. It was a realm of dark forests, jagged mountains, and a raw, untamed power. Its capital, Lysimachia, was less a city and more a sprawling military encampment, its walls built for war, not for beauty. The architecture was severe, functional, and utterly devoid of the graceful elegance of Alexandria. Her reception was a spectacle of brute force. Instead of scholars and priests, she was greeted by ranks of soldiers, their armor gleaming, their faces weathered and scarred. They watched her, this slender girl queen draped in Egyptian linen and Ptolemaic gold, with a raw curiosity that felt more predatory than welcoming. She was an exotic creature, a prize her king had won without lifting a sword. And then there was the king himself. Lysimachus was a physical manifestation of his kingdom. He was immense, broad-shouldered, with a presence that consumed all the space around him. His face was a roadmap of past battles, the most famous of which, a deep, jagged scar from a lion's claw, pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. When he took her hand, his grip was calloused and crushingly strong, the hand of a man who had strangled enemies, not caressed a wife. He looked her over, from the diadem on her head to the sandals on her feet, with the focused appraisal of a man inspecting a prize mare, noting her breeding and potential for producing strong foals. "A jewel from the Nile," he boomed, his voice a gravelly rumble better suited for shouting orders across a battlefield. "Ptolemy has sent his best." The compliment held no warmth, only a frank acknowledgement of her value as a high-stakes political bargain. The wedding ceremony was a brutal pagan affair. A bull was sacrificed on the altar, its hot blood steaming in the cold Thracian air. The priests chanted in a guttural dialect of Greek she barely recognized. The Thracian nobles, draped in wolfskins and heavy wool, drank deeply from silver goblets, their eyes constantly on her, assessing, judging. As Lysimachus placed the heavy gold wedding crown on her head, she felt less like a bride and more like a sacrificial animal being garlanded before the slaughter. It was not a caress, it was a brand, marking her as her property. In the days that followed, Arsinoe began the silent, desperate work of survival. The court was a lion's den, and she was the unfamiliar scent that set every beast on edge. She was assigned a lady-in-waiting, a nervous Greek woman named Lyra, whose family had been in Thrace for 2 generations. "Be wary of everyone, my queen," Lyra whispered during one of their first evenings together, her hands trembling as she brushed Arsinoe's hair. "The old guard, the ones who fought with the king in Asia, they are loyal only to him and to his son Agathocles. They see you as a foreign extravagance, an Egyptian sorceress who might poison the king's mind." The wedding night was the culmination of her terror. In the vast, torch-lit bedchamber, surrounded by furs and the heads of slain beasts mounted on the walls, he asserted his claim. His lovemaking was like his kingdom, efficient, forceful, and devoid of tenderness. It was an act of possession, a sealing of the treaty. As she lay beside the snoring, mountainous form of her husband, staring into the flickering darkness, Arsinoe felt a profound and chilling loneliness. She was a queen, yet she was a prisoner. She had a husband, yet she was utterly alone. But as weeks turned into months, fear began to calcify into resolve.
She would not be a frightened plaything. She would learn the rules of this savage game. She began to observe, to listen, to store away every slight, every alliance, every whispered secret. She learned to smile sweetly at the nobles who despised her, her mind a cold ledger, noting who was a friend, who was a foe, and who could be bought. The birth of her first son, Ptolemy, a year later, was her first taste of real power. It changed the way the court looked at her. She was no longer just a foreign jewel. She was the mother of a Thracian prince, a potential dynasty. And in the treacherous heart of the lion's den, Arsinoe began to feel her own claws start to grow.
Years passed. The girl from Alexandria vanished, eroded by the harsh Thracian winds and the constant grinding pressure of the court. In her place stood a woman, a queen, and most importantly, a mother. Her sons, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Philip, were the center of her universe. They were her only true alliance, the only part of this cold northern land that felt like her own. Her love for them was not a gentle, passive thing. It was a fierce, protective, and terrifying force, a shield she held against the world, and a sword she was prepared to wield. Her boys were Ptolemies in their blood, with her dark hair and intelligent eyes, but she was raising them to be lions. One afternoon she found them in the armory, their small hands struggling to lift a full-sized Macedonian Xephos. Instead of scolding them, she showed them the proper grip. "Power is not a thing you are given," she told them, her voice low and intense as she guided young Ptolemy's hands. "It is heavy. You must build the strength to hold it, or another will take it from your grasp. Never forget that." But their very existence created a fault line that ran directly through the kingdom. Lysimachus already had an heir, Agathocles, son of his first wife, a noblewoman of Odrysia. Agathocles was a man in his prime. He was handsome, charismatic, adored by the army he had led to victory multiple times, and respected by the old guard who saw him as the true Thracian heir. He was everything a king could want in a son, and he was a mortal threat to Arsinoe's children. The court, once a straightforward den of lions, had become a tangled serpent's nest of intrigue. Two factions, coiled and watchful, now dominated every feast, every council meeting, every whispered conversation. On one side was Agathocles and the grizzled veterans, men who saw Arsinoe as an ambitious foreign upstart, and her sons as half-Egyptian mongrels. On the other was the Queen's party, a growing collection of younger, ambitious nobles, Greek mercenaries and diplomats who saw a path to power through the young princes and their clever mother. Arsinoe felt the danger most keenly at public events. At a great feast celebrating a victory on the northern border, Agathocles made his grand entrance to a roar of approval from the soldiers. He moved through the hall with an easy confidence, a clap on the back for a general here, a shared joke with a nobleman there. He was the sun around which the Thracian court orbited. Arsinoe and her sons, seated beside the aging king, were a pale, distant moon. Ptolemy beamed with pride at his eldest son, a pride that sent a sliver of ice through Arsinoe's heart. Later, she saw Agathocles speaking with a group of his most loyal commanders. Their gazes drifted towards her table, where her sons were growing restless. The commanders' expressions were dismissive, contemptuous. In that moment, Arsinoe saw the future as a stark, brutal choice laid before her. A kingdom ruled by Agathocles would have no place for the sons of the Egyptian. They would be a threat, a loose thread to be cut. At best, they would be exiled. At worst, a convenient accident would befall them. Her resolve hardened into something cold and sharp as obsidian. This was not about ambition anymore. It was about survival. It was a primal maternal imperative. For her brood to live, the other claimant to the nest had to be removed. She began to watch Agathocles not as a rival, but as a problem to be solved. She studied his weaknesses, his pride, his occasional recklessness, his trust in his own popularity. She started to cultivate her own allies with more purpose, using her Ptolemaic gold and her sharp mind to weave a web of her own. The loving mother and the political assassin were merging into one.
The serpent in the nest was no longer just watching. She was preparing to strike.
The atmosphere in the palace grew thick and venomous like swamp gas. It began not with a shout, but with a whisper. A rumor planted in a fertile mind, a seed of doubt dropped into the ear of a suspicious courtier. Agathocles met secretly with an envoy from Seleucus. His men toast him as king when his father is not present. He grows impatient. No one could trace the source of the whispers. They seemed to rise from the very stones of the fortress, carried on the drafts and the corridors. Arsinoe, meanwhile, played the part of the anxious wife and mother. She would appear before Lysimachus, her eyes wide with carefully rehearsed fear. "My king, my husband," she would say, her voice trembling slightly. "I fear for you. I fear for our sons. The men, they speak of Agathocles with a fervor that is unsettling. They look at you, and their eyes are measuring you for a shroud." Lysimachus, his mind increasingly clouded by age, his body racked with old pains, was a field ripe for the sowing of paranoia. He had spent a lifetime fighting for his kingdom. The thought of it being stolen by his own son, the ultimate betrayal, preyed on his deepest fears. Arsinoe did not need to push. She simply nurtured the poison that was already there. She presented him with intercepted letters, forgeries so masterful they would have convinced a wiser man. She brought him witnesses, men in her pay who tearfully confessed to being part of a growing conspiracy, their testimonies a perfect tapestry of lies. The accusation, when it came, was therefore not a shock, but the grimly inevitable climax of a masterful campaign. Agathocles was arrested for high treason. He was dragged before his father, his face a mask of bewildered fury. He denied everything, his powerful voice echoing in the throne room, but his words fell on deaf ears. He was judged not by evidence, but by the fear and suspicion his father now held for him. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On the day of the execution, in the year 283 BCE, Arsinoe did not leave her chambers. She had claimed a sudden illness, a mother's anxiety making her too weak to stand. It was the perfect excuse. She sat before a loom, her hands moving with a steady, unwavering rhythm, weaving a complex pattern of purple and gold. The repetitive motion was calming, a small point of order in a world of chaos she had orchestrated. Her ladies-in-waiting moved about her silently, their eyes filled with a new kind of fear when they looked at her. She didn't need to see it. She could feel it. She felt the heavy tread of the guards marching Agathocles to the courtyard. She heard the distant muffled roar of the crowd, a sound of confusion and horror. And then she heard the silence, a profound, echoing quiet that was louder than any scream. A silence that meant the deed was done. A short while later, a loyal captain of her guard entered, knelt, and bowed his head. "It is finished, my queen." Her hands did not stop weaving. "The king's justice has been served," she said, her voice a placid stream flowing over a riverbed of cold stone. "May the gods grant his soul peace." That evening she walked through the palace. The very air had changed. The nobles who had once looked at her with contempt now averted their eyes, their faces pale with fear. They saw her not as the foreign queen, but as a sorceress, a Medea who had bewitched her king into murdering his own son. She had won. Her sons were safe. Their path to the throne was clear, paved with their half-brother's blood. But as she stood on a balcony, looking out at the kingdom she had just secured, she felt no triumph. There was only a vast, chilling emptiness. She had paid the blood price for her children's future, and in doing so had sacrificed the last remnants of the girl she once was. She was a queen, she was a mother, and she was a monster. The victory was absolute, and her isolation was complete.